On my first day as regional director, I discovered my cheating ex-husband worked at the company. The same man who'd secretly racked up $200,000 in debt before running off with my former best friend. He smirked when he saw me, thinking I was just another new hire. But his smile vanished when I walked into the executive boardroom, not as an employee, but as his new boss. Walking through the gleaming glass doors of Riverstone Financial, I felt my heart racing, not from nervousness, but anticipation. The security guard handed me my temporary badge, and I traced my fingers over the simple title, New Hire Orientation. If only Mark knew what that orientation really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, I discovered my husband of 8 years had been living a double life. Not only had he been having an affair with Rachel, my closest friend since college, but he'd also secretly maxed out our credit cards and taken out massive loans in my name. The night he left, he casually mentioned the $200,000 debt he'd hidden from me, as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "You'll never survive this, Sarah," he'd said, tossing his wedding ring onto our dining room table. "You're too soft for the corporate world. Always have been." Now, as I adjusted my crisp navy blazer in the elevator's mirrored walls, those words fueled rather than haunted me. The woman reflected back was different from the one Mark had abandoned. Her eyes held steel, and her shoulders carried the confidence of someone who'd turned devastation into determination. 42nd floor, the elevator chimed pleasantly. I stepped out into the bustling corridor of Riverstone's corporate headquarters. Various employees hurried past, some casting curious glances my way. They'd been buzzing about the mysterious new regional director for weeks, though only the board knew her identity. I caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Did you hear about the morning meeting? Something big's happening at 9:30. Mark's been insufferable all week. Perfect." The rumor mill was already churning, creating exactly the atmosphere I'd anticipated. I made my way to the HR department, where a cheerful woman named Patricia greeted me. "Welcome to Riverstone. You must be our new hire. Let's get your orientation started." She winked knowingly, one of the few who knew my true position. Through the glass walls of the break room, I spotted him. Mark stood in his office, commanding attention from his team with that familiar, arrogant stance. His designer suit and perfectly coiffed hair screamed of success, but I knew better. He'd built his image on borrowed money and stolen trust. "Sarah?" A voice startled me from my observations. "Sarah Mitchell?" I turned, maintaining perfect composure as Mark approached, his signature smirk playing across his lips. "Well, what a surprise. Finally decided to join the corporate world?" "Mark," I replied coolly, noting how his wedding band had been replaced by a flashier one, probably bought with stolen money. "I didn't expect to see you here." "That's Mr. Harrison in the office," he corrected, straightening his Italian silk tie. "I'm department head of investment relations. And you?" He glanced at my temporary badge, his smirk widening. "Are in orientation." Well, everyone has to start somewhere. Nearby employees pretended not to listen, but their typing had suspiciously slowed. I smiled politely, letting him savor what he thought was his moment of superiority. The antique clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m. In exactly 15 minutes, everything would change. "I'm looking forward to the morning meeting," I said, casually. "I hear there are some interesting announcements planned." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Good. Let him wonder. New hires don't typically attend executive meetings," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending tone. "Exceptions can be made," Patricia interjected, appearing at my side. "In fact, Sarah needs to head up now. The board is waiting." Mark's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "The board?" "Don't worry, Mark," I said, gathering my portfolio. Everything will make sense. Very soon. As I walked toward the executive conference room, I could feel his eyes following me. The weight of my real employee badge, the one announcing me as regional director, felt heavy in my blazer pocket. In my briefcase lay the documentation of every questionable decision Mark had made in his department, every risky investment he'd pushed through, every policy he'd bent. The board had been quite interested in my detailed analysis of the department's vulnerabilities, particularly given my unique insight into the man running it. They'd been even more impressed by my proposals for restructuring and my track record of turning around failing investment portfolios. The conference room doors loomed ahead, and through the glass, I could see the board members assembling. They nodded respectfully as I approached. Behind me, I heard Mark's expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. He'd followed, curiosity apparently getting the better of him. "After you, Mr. Harrison." I gestured to the door, my voice carrying a hint of authority that made him pause. The next 15 minutes would change everything. The carefully constructed facade Mark had built would crumble, just as he'd once shattered my world. But unlike him, I wasn't here for destruction. I was here to rebuild, not just my life, but an entire department that had suffered under his reckless leadership. As we settled into the conference room, my mind drifted to that devastating night 3 months ago. The memory was crystal clear, standing in our kitchen, staring at bank statements and credit card bills I'd never known existed, listening to Mark explain how he'd invested in his future, a future that apparently included my best friend, and a condo I was unknowingly paying for. The chairman's voice snapped me back to the present. "Before we begin, I believe we have some introductions to make." He smiled warmly in my direction. "Ms. Mitchell, would you like to do the honors?" I stood, smoothing my blazer with steady hands. The fear and helplessness I'd felt that night in. The kitchen had been replaced by a calm certainty. Mark sat across from me, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization as I pulled out my real employee badge. "Thank you, Chairman Reynolds. For those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Mitchell, your new Regional Director of Operations, and we have some serious changes to discuss." The sharp intake of breath from Mark's direction was just the beginning. The real work, transforming Riverstone's Investment Relations Department into something worth being proud of, was about to begin. The tense atmosphere in the conference room brought me back to that rainy Tuesday evening 3 months ago, the night my world imploded. I'd been working late at my investment firm, celebrating quietly after closing a major portfolio restoration project. My phone had buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Sarah, we need to talk. It's about Mark. Meet me at Cafe Luna in 20." The concern in her message seemed odd, but Rachel had been my closest friend since our college days at Northwestern. If she was worried about Mark, it had to be important. I'd grabbed my umbrella, telling myself the knot in my stomach was just anxiety about a potential problem with my husband. I found Rachel at our usual corner table, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged, hands wrapped around an untouched cappuccino. The moment our eyes met, I knew something was terribly wrong. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," she'd whispered, pulling out a stack of papers from her designer bag. "I found these in Mark's briefcase last night. You need to see them." My hands trembled as I spread the documents across the table. Credit, card statements, loan applications, bank transfers. All in my name, but with transactions I'd never seen before. The numbers blurred before my eyes. $47,000 charged to a credit card I didn't know existed. $83,000 in personal loans. Multiple cash advances. A second mortgage on our house. "There's more," Rachel's voice cracked. I've been seeing him, Sarah, for the past year." The cafe's ambient noise faded to a dull roar. My cappuccino sat untouched, growing cold as Rachel detailed everything. The secret meetings, the expensive gifts, the promises Mark had made. Each word felt like another brick being added to the wall crumbling down around me. "He said you knew about the loans," she continued, tears streaming down her face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, that you'd agreed to invest in his business ventures. But last night, I found these. She slid more papers across the table. He's been forging your signatures, using your excellent credit score, building this whole house of cards on your reputation. The final document made my blood run cold. A lease agreement for a luxury condo in the city's most exclusive district, signed 2 weeks ago. My name was on it, alongside Mark's. But I'd never seen it before. He's been planning to leave, Rachel admitted, her voice barely audible. The condo, it was supposed to be for us. But I can't. I can't be part of this anymore. You're my best friend, Sarah. I'd sat there numb, as the reality of my situation sank in. 8 years of marriage, a friendship spanning 15 years, all built on lies and manipulation. The numbers danced before my eyes. $200,000 in hidden debt, carefully accumulated over the past 2 years. Driving home that night, my mind raced through all the signs I'd missed. The late nights at the office, the mysterious business trips, the way Mark had insisted on handling all our finances, claiming he wanted to protect me from stress. His constant reminders that I was too trusting, too soft for the cutthroat business world. I found him in our home office, calmly packing files into his briefcase. The sight of him, so composed, so unbothered, made something snap inside me. Were you ever going to tell me? My voice sounded strange, even to my own ears. About the debt? About Rachel? About any of it? He'd looked up, and for a moment, I saw surprise flicker across his face. Then his expression settled into that familiar patronizing smile. Ah, Rachel finally grew a conscience, did she? $200,000, Mark, in my name. Don't be dramatic, Sarah. It's just business. Investments require capital, and your credit score made everything so much easier. He'd continued packing, as if we were discussing something as mundane as grocery shopping. Besides, you never cared about the financial details, always happy to let me handle everything. So trusting, so naive. I trusted you because you were my husband, and that trust built us a beautiful life, didn't it? He gestured around our expensively furnished home. The house, the cars, the vacations. Did you really think your modest salary paid for all this? The magnitude of his betrayal hit me in waves. Every luxury I'd thought we'd earned together had been built on lies and stolen credit. Our entire life had been a carefully constructed facade. I've already moved most of my things to the new place, he continued, straightening his tie in the mirror. You can keep the house, though good luck making the payments with the new mortgage. Maybe this will finally force you to develop a backbone. The business world doesn't reward softness, Sarah. I tried to teach you that. He'd tossed his wedding ring onto the desk, a final calculated insult. You'll never survive. This, the debt, the legal battles, the corporate world you've always been too afraid to really embrace. You're too soft. Always have been. The sound of Chairman Reynolds' voice pulled me back to the present moment in the conference room. Mark sat across from me, still radiating that same arrogant confidence. He didn't know that his words that night hadn't broken me, they'd transformed me. In the 3 months since he'd walked out, I'd launched myself into an intensive investigation of our finances. Every transaction, every forged signature, every hidden account laid bare. I'd discovered that Mark's business ventures were a web of risky investments and questionable deals, many involving Riverstone Financial's clients. The same skills that had made me a successful portfolio manager, attention to detail, pattern recognition, strategic thinking, became weapons in my arsenal. I'd tracked down other victims of Mark's schemes, built a comprehensive case, and presented it to Riverstone's board along with my proposals for departmental reform. They'd been impressed not just by my discovery of the irregularities, but by my strategic vision for preventing similar situations in the future. The position of regional director had been created specifically to implement these changes. Looking at Mark now, his expensive suit bought with stolen money, his new wedding ring probably purchased on credit, I felt neither hatred nor fear. Those emotions had been transformed into something more powerful: purpose. The chairman was distributing folders containing my analysis of the department's vulnerabilities and my proposed solutions. Mark's face grew increasingly pale as he flipped through the pages, recognizing his own transactions laid bare in meticulous detail. "Ms. Mitchell," Chairman Reynolds said, "perhaps you'd like to begin by discussing the irregularities you've discovered in the Investment Relations Department's client accounts." I stood, my voice steady and clear. The woman Mark had dismissed as too soft had become his reckoning, and his education in true business ethics was about to begin. The transformation from victim to victor hadn't been about revenge. It had been about justice, reform, and proving that integrity and strength weren't mutually exclusive. As I began my presentation, I saw Rachel's name among the meeting attendees. She'd recently been promoted to compliance officer, her own journey of redemption parallel to mine. Mark's carefully constructed world of financial manipulation was about to change, and I would be the architect of that change. The debt he'd left me with had become the catalyst for a transformation neither of us had seen coming. "These irregularities," I continued, standing at the head of the conference room, "represent just the surface of what I've uncovered in the Investment Relations Department." I clicked to the next slide of my presentation, watching Mark's face grow increasingly ashen as his questionable practices were laid bare before the board. The spacious conference room on Riverstone Financial's 42nd floor had become an arena of silent tension. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table, where 20 of the company's most influential figures sat transfixed by my presentation. I noticed Amanda Torres, head of human resources, taking detailed notes. She'd been instrumental in my hiring, recognizing the need for systematic change in the company's oversight procedures. Her dark eyes met mine with quiet approval as I detailed the next set of findings. In the past 18 months alone, client funds were redirected through a complex series of high-risk investments, I explained, bringing up a detailed flowchart. Each transaction technically legal but ethically questionable, designed to generate quick returns while exposing clients to unprecedented risk levels. A sharp intake of breath came from Michael Patel, Chief Risk Officer. His reputation for integrity was well known in the industry. And these transactions were all approved by... His voice trailed off as he glanced at Mark. "By the department, head of investment relations," I confirmed, my voice steady. "Mr. Harrison's signature appears on every authorization form." Mark shifted in his leather chair, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of evidence. "These were all approved investments," he interjected, attempting to regain control. "Every client signed the necessary paperwork." "Interesting you should mention paperwork," I replied, clicking to the next slide. "Notice the signature patterns on these authorization forms." I approached the screen, pointing out subtle discrepancies. Several clients have confirmed they never saw these documents, let alone signed them. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Through the glass walls, I could see curious employees gathering, drawn by the unusual length and intensity of the morning meeting. Among them stood Rachel, her face a mixture of guilt and determination. Our eyes met briefly. She'd provided crucial information about Mark's methods, part of her own journey toward redemption. Ms. Mitchell, Victoria Reeves, the senior vice president, leaned forward. "Your analysis is thorough, but what's your proposed solution? Riverstone's reputation is at stake." This was the moment I'd prepared for. I opened my portfolio, distributing comprehensive reform proposals to each board member. "A complete restructuring of the Investment Relations Department," I began. "New oversight protocols, transparent client communication channels, and a revolutionary risk assessment system." As the board members flipped through my proposal, I could feel Mark's glare intensifying. He'd severely underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as too soft for business. Each page of my proposal dismantled the system of manipulation he'd built, replacing it with structures designed for transparency and ethical practice. Implementation begins immediately, Chairman Reynolds announced, closing his copy of the proposal. Ms. Mitchell will oversee the transition as regional director. Mr. Harrison, you'll report directly to her during this restructuring period. Mark's expensive pen snapped in his grip, sending tiny drops of ink across his crisp white shirt. This is absurd, he sputtered. I've run this department for 5 years. You can't possibly— Your methods have exposed Riverstone to significant liability, Victoria Reeves cut in. Ms. Mitchell's appointment isn't up for debate. The board's decision is unanimous. The next hour unfolded in a blur of discussion and planning. Department heads asked questions about the transition, while Mark sat in seething silence. Outside the conference room, word was spreading rapidly through the office. I could see employees, huddled in small groups, smartphones in hand as the news traveled through informal channels. Finally, Chairman Reynolds closed the meeting. As board members filed out, many stopped to welcome me officially, their handshakes firm and approving. Mark remained seated, staring at my proposal as if trying to find a loophole, an escape route. Mr. Harrison, I said, gathering my materials. I'll need a complete audit of your current client portfolio by tomorrow morning. My office, the corner office you're currently using, will need to be cleared by end of day. He looked up, his face a storm of emotions. You planned this, he accused quietly. All of it. No, Mark, I replied, keeping my voice professional. You planned this, the day you decided to forge my signature on those loan documents. I'm just implementing the consequences. As I left the conference room, Amanda Torres fell into step beside me. Security has been notified, she murmured. They'll supervise Mr. Harrison's office relocation. His new workspace is ready on the 38th floor. I nodded, watching. The office dynamics shift in real time. Employees who had once scurried away from Mark's approach now stood their ground, their postures straighter, their expressions more confident. The culture of fear he'd cultivated was already beginning to crack. My temporary badge had been replaced with my official credentials. Sarah Mitchell, Regional Director. The weight of it felt right against my blazer, a tangible symbol of transformation. Through the glass walls of what would soon be my office, I could see Mark roughly packing his personal items, his movements angry and jerky. Sarah? Rachel approached hesitantly, holding a stack of files. These are the compliance reports you requested. And I want you to know, the team is ready to support your changes. We've needed this for a long time. Looking at her now, I saw neither my former best friend nor my husband's mistress, but a professional working to correct past mistakes. Thank you, Rachel. We'll need everyone on board for what's ahead. The morning sun had reached its peak, streaming through the windows, and illuminating the office space in harsh clarity. In the harsh light, the cracks in Mark's carefully constructed facade were visible to everyone. His designer suit couldn't hide the sweat staining his collar. His expensive watch couldn't disguise the tremor in his hands as he packed his awards and photographs. Ms. Mitchell, David Patterson, a junior analyst, approached with a handful of documents. I have some concerns about these investment strategies Mr. Harrison implemented last month. The risk levels seem— Bring them to my office in an hour, I interrupted gently. Everything will be reviewed and addressed. The fear in David's eyes was familiar. I'd seen it in my own reflection months ago, staring at mounting debt statements and forged signatures. But now, that fear was being replaced by something else. Hope for change, for accountability, for a workplace built on integrity rather than intimidation. My phone buzzed with messages from other department heads, all eager to discuss the coming changes. Mark's power structure was crumbling, but unlike him, I wasn't interested in building a kingdom. I was here to build something far more valuable, a system of transparency, ethics, and genuine growth. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back to the old ways of doing business. The woman Mark had tried to destroy was now the architect of his professional reckoning, and every document, every signature, every transaction would be brought into the light. The next 48 hours at Riverstone Financial unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of change. From my new corner office, I watched the ripple effects spread through every department. Mark had been relegated to a small cubicle on the 38th floor, but his presence still lingered in the whispered conversations and furtive glances of employees who'd worked under his regime. My morning began with a steady stream of revelations. David Patterson, the junior analyst who'd approached me earlier, arrived with a stack of folders that told a story of systematic manipulation. "These investment strategies," he explained, spreading documents across my desk, "Mr. Harrison would pressure us to push high-risk options to clients, especially retirees with substantial savings." His hands trembled slightly as he pointed out specific transactions. The commission rates were excessive, but anyone who questioned it found themselves relegated to dead-end assignments, I finished, noting how he relaxed slightly at my understanding. "How many other analysts have similar stories, David?" "Most of us," he admitted. "There's a whole drawer in his old filing cabinet labeled Special Projects. That's where he kept the documentation for his riskiest ventures." I made a note to have security escort me through a thorough search of Mark's former office. Every drawer, every file, every post-it note could reveal another piece of his elaborate scheme. Through the glass walls, I spotted Rachel heading toward my office, her expression urgent. The dynamic between us had shifted from personal betrayal to professional alliance, something neither of us had anticipated. "Sarah," she entered, closing the door behind her. "The compliance team just flagged something significant. Remember? Those property investment funds Mark was so proud of?" She laid out a complex web of transactions, each one more questionable than the last. The same patterns I'd seen in our personal finances played out on a corporate scale, using other people's good credit and trust to build his illusions of success. "Get me everything you have on these funds," I instructed. "And Rachel, have Amanda arrange an all-hands meeting for tomorrow morning. It's time to address the entire department." As Rachel left, I noticed Mark watching from the corridor, his new polyester shirt a far cry from his usual tailored suits. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something flicker across his face, not just anger, but fear. He knew what I was capable of finding. Victoria Reeves, the senior VP, stopped by unannounced. "The board is impressed with your initial findings," she said, settling into a visitor's chair. "But they're concerned about potential client panic if this becomes public." "I have a plan for that too," I replied, pulling out another folder from my briefcase. "A complete client communication strategy, emphasizing transparency and our commitment to correcting past mismanagement. Trust isn't built on hiding mistakes, Victoria. It's built on addressing them openly and implementing real change." She studied the proposal, nodding slowly. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? Quite different from the woman Mark described in his personnel reports." I smiled slightly, remembering his dismissive evaluations of my capabilities. People often mistake kindness for weakness. That's their mistake. By late afternoon, the office atmosphere had transformed. Employees who had once hurried past Mark's office with downcast eyes now walked confidently, sharing information freely. The culture of fear was being replaced by one of collaboration. Amanda Torres arrived with the preliminary HR report. "We've had 16 employees come forward since this morning," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Sexual harassment, bullying, financial coercion. Mark's leadership style was even worse than we suspected. Document everything," I instructed. "Every incident, every witness statement." The culture of silence ends now. Through my office windows, I could see the sun setting over the city skyline, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The same view Mark had enjoyed while building his house of cards would now witness its dismantling. My phone buzzed with a message from Chairman Reynolds. Board dinner tomorrow night. Bring your full findings. Time to discuss Phase 2. Mark's voice carried through the open door. He was arguing with someone by the elevators. This is my department. These are my clients. She has no right to— Your department? David Patterson's voice replied, stronger than I'd ever heard it. You mean the department you used to exploit clients and bully employees? Those days are over, Mr. Harrison. The exchange drew curious onlookers. Mark's face flushed red as he realized his outburst had an audience. His attempt to intimidate had backfired, revealing his desperation instead. Security Chief James Martinez appeared at my door. Ms. Mitchell, we've secured the files from Mr. Harrison's old office. You'll want to see this right away. The filing. Cabinet labeled Special Projects contained exactly what I'd expected, evidence of Mark's systematic abuse of client trust. Each folder revealed another layer of manipulation, another breach of ethics, another example of how he'd used his position to serve his own interests. Have these copied and secured, I instructed Martinez. And increase security presence on the 38th floor. I suspect tomorrow's announcements might trigger some emotional responses. As the office emptied for the evening, I stood at my window, watching the city lights flicker to life. 3 months ago, I'd stood in my kitchen, staring at evidence of Mark's personal betrayal. Now I stood in his former office, surrounded by evidence of his professional ones. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. He'd underestimated me in both arenas, assuming my integrity was a weakness he could exploit. Instead, it had become the foundation of his downfall. My phone buzzed again, a text from my mother. Saw Riverstone's press release about your appointment. So proud of you, honey. Show them what real leadership looks like. Tomorrow's all-hands meeting would change everything. The carefully gathered evidence, the testimonies, the documented patterns of abuse, all would be brought into the light. Mark's reign of manipulation was ending, but unlike him, I wasn't interested in building a power structure based on fear. Real strength, I'd learned, didn't come from intimidating others or exploiting their trust. It came from creating systems that empowered people to do their best work, from fostering an environment where integrity wasn't seen as weakness, but as the cornerstone of success. The night deepened, but lights still burned in offices throughout the building. Employees who had once rushed to leave at 5 now stayed late, eager to be part of the coming changes. Their dedication wasn't driven by fear of reprisals, but by genuine investment in transformation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, watching the city gleam below, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate how far I'd come. The woman Mark had dismissed as too soft had become the architect of his professional reckoning, and her work was just beginning. The $200,000 debt he'd left me with had become an unexpected gift, a catalyst for uncovering not just his personal betrayal, but his entire network of professional misconduct. Sometimes I realized the greatest strength comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into purpose. As I prepared for tomorrow's all-hands meeting, my mind drifted back to the darkest day of my life, the day after Mark's betrayal was exposed. The memory was no longer painful, but it had shaped everything that followed. I'd woken up that morning to an empty house and a series of automated emails from our joint bank accounts. Insufficient funds, payment declined, account overdrawn. Each notification hammered home the reality of my situation. Mark hadn't just taken my trust, he'd systematically dismantled my financial security. Standing in our walk-in closet, I'd noticed the gaps where his expensive suits once hung. The safe in the back wall stood open and empty. He'd cleared out everything, including my grandmother's jewelry that I'd stored there for safekeeping. Even in leaving, he'd found ways to wound. The kitchen counter was littered with past due, notices I'd never seen before, bills for credit cards I didn't know existed, loan statements with my forged signature. Each document told the story of Mark's careful manipulation, his calculated betrayal. My phone had been buzzing constantly, Rachel's repeated calls, which I ignored, and messages from friends asking about rumors they'd heard. Mark, it seemed, was already controlling the narrative, telling anyone who would listen about his troubled marriage and how he'd finally found happiness. The breaking point came when I opened my laptop to check our investment accounts. Everything was gone. Our retirement savings, our emergency fund, even the money I'd been setting aside for my nephew's college fund, all transferred out over the past months through a series of small transactions I'd never noticed. I'd collapsed. At the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of my own blind trust. The woman staring back from the chrome refrigerator door looked broken, lost. That reflection became my turning point. With trembling hands, I'd pulled out a fresh legal pad and begun to write. Every transaction I could remember. Every time Mark had dismissed my questions about our finances. Every business trip that now seemed suspicious. The pattern emerged with devastating clarity. The doorbell rang. It was Lisa Morgan, my accountant. Friend from college. I hadn't called her, but Rachel must have reached out. Lisa took one look at the papers scattered across my kitchen, and her professional demeanor took over. First, she'd said, pulling out her laptop, we document everything. Then we fight back. Hour after hour, we traced the web of financial deceit. Mark had been methodical, starting small and gradually escalating. A credit card here, a personal loan there, always using my stellar credit score, always forging my signature with practiced ease. Sarah, Lisa had said gently, looking up from a particularly troubling document. This goes beyond personal finances. Some of these transactions, they look like the same patterns I've seen in corporate fraud cases. That statement had sparked something in my mind. I'd pulled up Riverstone Financial's public records, where Mark had recently been promoted to department head. The similarities between his personal financial schemes and certain corporate investment patterns were impossible to ignore. He's doing it there too, I'd whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The same patterns, the same techniques, just on a larger scale. Lisa's expression had hardened. Then that's our way in. Corporate fraud leaves a trail, Sarah. If he's using the same methods at work, we'd worked through the night, ordering takeout that grew cold as we built a case. Every document was scanned, every transaction logged, every pattern noted. By dawn, my dining room looked like a war room, with papers taped to walls and sticky notes creating a timeline of deception. The morning sun had streamed through the windows, illuminating the chaos of my disrupted life. But something else was illuminated too, a path forward. Mark had taught me more than he realized about financial manipulation. Now those lessons would become weapons in my arsenal. I'd showered and dressed in my best suit, the one Mark had always said was too severe. For me, looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The soft, trusting woman he'd married was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that true strength comes from facing betrayal and choosing to rise above it. "What's the plan?" Lisa had asked, watching me gather the most damning documents into a portfolio. "First, we go to Riverstone's board," I'd replied, my voice steady. "They need to know who they've put in charge of their clients' money. Then we rebuild, not just my life, but every system he's corrupted." The next weeks had been a blur of legal meetings, credit agencies, and careful documentation. Each day revealed new depths to Mark's betrayal, but also showed me strengths I never knew I possessed. My attention to detail, my ability to spot patterns, my understanding of financial systems, all became tools for recovery. I'd withdrawn from social activities, focusing every spare moment on building my case. Friends left concerned voicemails, not understanding that I was engaged in the fight of my life. Mark had counted on my silence, on my shame. He'd expected me to crumble under the weight of his betrayal. Instead, I'd turned that weight into foundation, stones, building a new future from the ruins of his deception. Every document I uncovered, every pattern I traced, brought me closer to not just recovery, but transformation. The day I'd finally presented my findings to Riverstone's board had been surreal. I'd walked into their executive boardroom not as a victim seeking justice, but as a professional exposing systemic fraud. My personal connection to Mark was almost secondary to the evidence I'd gathered of his corporate misconduct. Now, standing in my new office at Riverstone, those memories felt distant, yet crucial. The pain of betrayal had forged something unexpected. A leader who understood both the mechanics of financial manipulation and the importance of ethical oversight. Tomorrow's all-hands meeting wouldn't just expose Mark's misconduct, it would lay the groundwork for a new corporate culture. One built on transparency, accountability, and the understanding that true strength comes not from exploiting others' trust, but from earning and maintaining it. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Saw the company announcement. From victim to regional director in 3 months. Not bad for someone too soft for business. I smiled, remembering Mark's words from that devastating night. He'd been right about one thing. I had been too soft, too trusting. But he'd failed to understand that softness, when tempered by betrayal and fortified by purpose, could become an unshakable kind of strength. The sun had set fully now, leaving the city sparkling below. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but I was ready. The woman Mark had tried to destroy had instead been transformed, and his carefully constructed world of financial manipulation was about to meet its match. The early morning light filtered through the windows of my office as I reviewed the final preparations for the all-hands meeting. The past 3 months hadn't just been about gathering evidence, they'd been a calculated journey of transformation. After my initial presentation to Riverstone's board, I'd thrown myself into an intensive study of corporate fraud detection. My dining room had become a makeshift war room, walls covered with financial flowcharts and regulatory guidelines. Every night I worked until exhaustion forced me to stop, then started again at dawn. My first breakthrough came when I connected with Maria Santos, a forensic accountant specializing in investment fraud. She'd taken one look at my evidence and recognized the patterns immediately. Classic affinity fraud, she'd explained, spreading the documents across her desk. He used his position of trust to target vulnerable clients, just like he did with you. But you've caught something many investigators miss: the parallel patterns between personal and corporate manipulation. Together, we'd spent weeks building an airtight case. Maria taught me the intricacies of forensic accounting, while I shared my intimate knowledge of Mark's manipulation techniques. Every transaction was scrutinized, every pattern documented, every client account examined for irregularities. "Your attention to detail is remarkable," Maria had commented one late night, as we traced a particularly complex series of transactions. Most people would have missed these subtle connections. What she didn't know was that each discovery fueled my determination. Every fraudulent transaction I uncovered represented someone else's trust betrayed, someone else's financial security compromised. The $200,000 debt Mark had left me with became almost insignificant compared to the millions he'd put at risk through his corporate schemes. I'd also reached out to Catherine Wright, a corporate governance expert who'd made headlines exposing investment fraud at major firms. Her insights proved invaluable in developing my proposal for Riverstone's restructuring. "The problem isn't just individual bad actors," Catherine had explained during our first meeting. "It's systems that enable them. You need to rebuild from the ground up." Following her guidance, I'd immersed myself in studying corporate restructuring and ethical governance. Every free moment was devoted to learning: regulatory compliance, risk management, Organizational psychology. Mark had assumed my softness was a weakness, never realizing it would enable me to understand and address the human cost of financial manipulation. The transformation wasn't just professional. I'd sold the house Mark and I had shared, using the proceeds to start repaying the fraudulent debts he'd left in my name. My new apartment was smaller, but felt cleaner somehow, unburdened by memories of betrayal. Lisa Morgan, my accountant friend, had helped me rebuild my financial foundation from scratch. "You're not just surviving this," she'd said, watching me methodically work through each creditor. "You're creating a blueprint for others to follow." The hiring process at Riverstone had been intense. 5 interviews, multiple presentations, detailed background checks. But with each round, I'd grown more confident. The board wasn't just hiring someone to catch a fraudster. They were bringing in a leader who understood both the mechanics of manipulation and the importance of prevention. I'd also spent time building relationships with key personnel at Riverstone, particularly those who'd worked directly under Mark. Amanda Torres in HR had been especially helpful, sharing insights into the toxic culture he'd created. It wasn't just financial manipulation, she'd confided during one of our early meetings. He created an environment of fear and silence. Anyone who questioned his methods found themselves isolated or pushed out. That information had shaped my restructuring plan. Beyond just financial oversight, I'd developed comprehensive protocols for employee protection and ethical reporting. The culture of fear would be replaced by one of transparency and collaboration. Rachel's role in all this had been unexpected. After her initial confession about the affair, she'd thrown herself into gathering evidence of Mark's professional misconduct. Her position in compliance had given her access to crucial documentation. "I know I can never fully make amends," she'd said during one late-night planning session, "but I can help ensure he never does this to anyone else." The week before my official start date, I'd conducted anonymous surveys among Riverstone's investment staff. The responses painted a picture of systematic intimidation and ethical compromise. Junior analysts described being pressured to push high-risk investments on vulnerable clients. Administrative staff reported covering up questionable transactions under threat of termination. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, each documented pattern had become part of a larger strategy. Mark had built his empire on fear and manipulation. I would dismantle it through transparency and reform. I'd also taken time to understand Riverstone's legitimate operations, its market position, its potential for positive impact. This wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about transforming a company into what it could and should be. The preparation hadn't been solely professional. I'd worked with a counselor to process the personal trauma of Mark's betrayal, turning emotional wounds into sources of insight and strength. The woman who had once trusted blindly now understood the delicate balance between confidence and caution. Physical transformation played its part too. Gone were the soft, approachable suits Mark had always encouraged me to wear. My new wardrobe was chosen for authority and presence, armor for the corporate battlefield I was about to enter. Now, reviewing the final details for the all-hands meeting, I could appreciate how each step of the journey had been necessary. The late nights analyzing documents, the weekends studying corporate law, the hours practicing presentations, all had prepared me for what was to come. My phone buzzed with a message from Maria. "Just reviewed your final presentation. They won't know what hit them. Remember, you're not just exposing fraud, you're setting a new standard." She was right. This wasn't about revenge, it was about revolution. Mark had taught me more than he realized about the mechanics of financial manipulation. Now those lessons would become the foundation for systematic change. The sun had fully risen, painting the city in morning light. In a few hours, the office would fill with employees who'd worked under Mark's regime of fear. By day's end, they would understand that a new era was beginning. I straightened my desk, ensuring every document was in place for the upcoming revelations. The journey from betrayed wife to corporate reformer had been intense, but necessary. Mark had dismissed me as too soft for business, never understanding. That true strength comes in many forms. The woman who had once trusted blindly now carried the power to transform an entire corporate culture. The preparation was complete. The time for change had arrived. The Riverstone Financial Conference Center buzzed with nervous energy as employees filed in for the all-hands meeting. Through the glass doors, I could see Mark settled into his usual spot in the front row, still carrying himself with an air of authority despite his recent demotion. He had no idea that the next hour would dismantle everything he'd built. Chairman Reynolds opened the session precisely at 9:00 a.m. Good morning, everyone. Today marks a significant transition for Riverstone Financial. Ms. Mitchell will lead us through some important changes in our investment operations. I took the podium, surveying the sea of faces before me. Junior analysts who'd been pressured to compromise their ethics. Administrative staff who'd been forced to cover questionable transactions. Senior managers who'd looked the other way. Each person in this room had been affected by Mark's toxic leadership. 3 months ago, I began, my voice steady and clear. I presented the board with evidence of systematic misconduct within our investment relations department. Today, you'll understand why changes were necessary and how we move forward. The first slide appeared on the massive screen behind me, a complex web of transactions that had taken weeks to unravel. This chart represents client funds movement over the past 18 months. Notice these patterns of high-risk investments, each approved under questionable circumstances. Mark's posture stiffened. He recognized these transactions. They were his signature methods, now exposed in vivid detail. Mr. Patterson, I called out to the junior analyst who'd first brought concerns to my attention. Could you explain what happened when you questioned these investment strategies? David stood, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger. I was told to either push the high-risk options or find another job. Mr. Harrison said questioning his methods would be career suicide. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Other analysts began nodding, recognition dawning on their faces. This culture of intimidation ends today, I announced, clicking to the next slide. We've documented 47 instances of ethical violations, ranging from pressure tactics to direct manipulation of client information. The screen filled with evidence, emails, altered documents, forged signatures, each piece meticulously gathered and verified. Mark's face grew increasingly pale as his methods were laid bare. Ms. Mitchell, he interrupted, standing abruptly. These were all approved investments. Every transaction followed company protocols. Protocols you manipulated, I cut in, bringing up the next set of documents. Let's discuss the special projects files found in your office. The room fell silent as I detailed how client funds had been channeled into increasingly risky ventures, how documentation had been altered, how pressure had been applied to silence questions. This isn't just about financial misconduct, I continued, nodding to Amanda Torres. Human Resources has collected extensive evidence of systematic intimidation and harassment. Amanda stood, her professional demeanor masking the anger I knew she felt. We've received 16 formal complaints in the past week alone. Employees were threatened with termination if they raised concerns about Mr. Harrison's methods. Mark's carefully maintained facade began to crack. This is ridiculous, he sputtered. A witch hunt orchestrated by your ex-wife? I finished. For him, my voice level. That's what you were going to say, isn't it? Let's address that directly. The next slide showed personal financial documents, the fraudulent loans and credit cards he'd taken out in my name. Mr. Harrison's methods weren't limited to corporate manipulation. His pattern of financial fraud began with personal relationships, perfected through intimate betrayal, then scaled up to corporate level. Rachel stood up from her seat in compliance. I can confirm these patterns. as both a personal victim of Mr. Harrison's manipulation and a compliance officer, I've seen how he used the same techniques to exploit trust in both spheres. Mark's face contorted with rage. You're both just bitter about discovering your fraud? I interrupted. About exposing your manipulation? This isn't about personal grievances, Mark. This is about systematic abuse of trust and position. The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of revelation. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, each documented violation built upon the last. Department heads stepped forward to share what they'd discovered in their own divisions. Employees began raising hands, offering their own experiences of intimidation and coercion. Mark's kingdom of fear was crumbling in real time, each brick of his carefully constructed facade falling away to reveal the rot beneath. Moving forward, I announced, bringing up the restructuring plan. Every aspect of our investment operations will be transformed. New oversight protocols, transparent reporting systems, and ethical investment guidelines are just the beginning. The Afghan energy in the room shifted as I outlined the changes. Fear gave way to hope as employees realized they were being offered not just protection, but empowerment. Every person in this room has a role in our transformation, I continued. Your insights, your concerns, your suggestions, all will be heard and valued. The era of silence and intimidation is over. I clicked to the final slide, displaying the new organizational structure. Effective immediately, all investment decisions will undergo multi-level review. Client communications will be transparent and documented. Every employee will have direct access to compliance resources without fear of retaliation. Mark stood again, his expensive suit no longer able to mask his desperation. The board can't possibly... The board fully supports these changes, Chairman Reynolds interrupted, stepping forward. In fact, Ms. Mitchell's restructuring plan has become a model for our other regional offices. The room erupted in questions, but they weren't directed at Mark anymore. Employees turned to me, eager to understand their roles in the new system, hungry for the chance to work with integrity again. As the meeting concluded, Mark remained rooted to his spot, watching his influence evaporate. The power he'd built through fear was being replaced by something stronger. Authentic leadership based on transparency and trust. Mr. Harrison, I addressed him directly, you'll find your new assignment details waiting at your desk. Your client accounts are being redistributed pending full audit. He stared at me, finally seeing not the woman he'd dismissed as too soft, but the leader who'd outmaneuvered him at every turn. You won't get away with this, he muttered, but his words carried no weight anymore. I already have, I replied quietly. The difference is, I'm doing it legally and ethically. As employees filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or share their relief at the changes. The transformation wasn't just organizational. It was personal for every person who'd suffered under Mark's regime. Amanda Torres appeared at my side. Security is ready to escort Mr. Harrison to his new position. IT has already restricted his system access. I nodded, watching Mark's retreating figure. The man who'd once dominated this office with fear now walked alone, his power stripped away, not through manipulation, but through truth. The sunlight streamed through the conference center windows, illuminating a room that felt somehow cleaner, lighter. The weight of secrets and fear had been replaced by the possibility of genuine change. My phone buzzed, a message from Maria Santos. Just watch the live stream. Masterful execution. This is how real corporate reform happens. The climactic moment I'd spent months preparing for had arrived and passed, but the real work was just beginning. Transforming a corporate culture takes more than exposing wrongdoing. It requires building something better in its place. Looking at the eager faces around me, I knew we were ready for that challenge. Mark had taught me more than he realized about the mechanics of power. Now those lessons would fuel not revenge, but revolution. The hours following the all-hands meeting passed in a whirlwind of activity. The 42nd floor of Riverstone Financial had transformed into a hub of purposeful energy, each department adapting to the seismic shifts in company culture. David Patterson had organized an impromptu gathering of junior analysts in one of the conference rooms. Through the glass walls, I could see them poring over client portfolios, identifying questionable investments that needed immediate attention. Their faces showed a mixture of determination and relief, finally free to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. "Ms. Mitchell," Amanda Torres appeared at my office door. "We've had 23 additional employees come forward in the past hour alone, each one with documented evidence of Mark's misconduct." I gestured for her to take a seat, noting how the office dynamics had already begun to shift. Employees who had once scurried past this corner office now walked with confidence, making eye contact, sharing information freely. "There's something else," Amanda continued, pulling out a thick folder. "We found his private performance review files, the real ones, not the sanitized versions he submitted to HR. He kept detailed notes on every employee, personal information, financial vulnerabilities, anything he could use as leverage." The folder contained years of calculated manipulation. Mark had treated his department like a personal fiefdom, collecting ammunition against anyone who might challenge his authority. Each page revealed another layer of his systematic abuse of power. "Get these to legal immediately," I instructed. "And Amanda, set up a support system for affected employees. They'll need resources to process this." Through my office windows, I spotted Mark being escorted to his new position on the 38th floor. His designer suit looked somehow ill-fitting now, his confident stride reduced to a shuffle. Security Chief Martinez followed at a discreet distance, ensuring the transition remained peaceful. Rachel knocked softly before entering, her arms full of compliance reports. "The audit team is already finding discrepancies in his major client accounts. Some of these investment structures, they're incredibly risky, hidden behind layers of complicated paperwork. Start with the retiree accounts," I directed, remembering how Mark had targeted vulnerable clients. "Those need to be stabilized first." The afternoon brought a steady stream of revelations. Victoria Reeves, the senior VP, arrived with news from other regional offices. "They're finding similar patterns," she reported, settling into a chair. "Mark's methods apparently inspired some copycats. The board wants to implement your oversight protocols company-wide." Each hour seemed to uncover new depths to Mark's manipulation. Department heads reported discovering hidden files, altered records, evidence of systematic intimidation. But alongside each revelation came signs of positive change. I watched as Sarah Zhang, a previously quiet risk analyst, confidently presented her concerns about an investment strategy to her team. Months ago, such initiative would have been punished. Now, it was celebrated. "Ms. Mitchell," David Patterson reappeared, his earlier nervousness replaced by professional purpose. "We've identified the highest-risk client portfolios. The team is ready to begin restructuring them following the new protocols." The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal for every employee who'd suffered under Mark's regime. I noticed people gathering in small groups, sharing stories they'd been afraid to tell before, supporting colleagues who were just beginning to process their experiences. My phone buzzed with messages from industry contacts. Word of the changes at Riverstone was spreading fast. Mark's reputation in the financial world was crumbling as quickly as his corporate empire had. "They found something in the executive bathroom," Amanda reported, returning with another file. "A hidden tablet containing private information about board members. He was collecting leverage against everyone." The discovery painted an even clearer picture of Mark's methods. He hadn't just manipulated finances. He'd built an elaborate web of personal information and threats, using fear to maintain his position. As evening approached, I called another brief meeting with the department heads. The conference room felt different now, energized rather than tense, collaborative rather than competitive. The immediate changes are just the beginning, I explained, outlining the next phases of our transformation. Every process, every policy, every aspect of our operations will be rebuilt with transparency and ethics at its core. Michael Patel, the Chief Risk Officer, nodded in agreement. The culture shift is already visible. People are speaking up, asking questions, challenging questionable practices. Through the glass walls, I could see Mark in his new cubicle, staring at his computer screen. The man who had once dominated this floor through fear now sat isolated, his power stripped away, not through manipulation, but through truth. Ms. Mitchell, Patricia from HR appeared with another update. We've had requests from several employees for ethics training. They want to learn how to identify and prevent similar situations in the future. The request spoke volumes about the changing culture. Employees weren't just accepting new policies, they were actively seeking ways to maintain and strengthen them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office floor, I took a moment to observe the transformation. Departments that had once competed now collaborated. Information flowed freely where secrets had once festered. Trust was slowly replacing fear. My phone lit up with a message from Lisa Morgan. Saw the company announcement about the restructuring. From victim to reformer, you've turned his betrayal into a blueprint for change. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mark's attempts to destroy me had instead created someone stronger, not just personally, but professionally. The skills I'd developed uncovering his fraud had become tools for corporate reform. Amanda returned with one final report for the day. Security did a sweep of his old office. They found documentation of every employee he'd forced out over the years. Some of these people, their careers were destroyed because they tried to speak up. Contact them, I instructed. Let them know what's happening here. Offer them a chance to share their stories if they wish. As the office quieted for the evening, I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. The day's events had set irreversible changes in motion. Mark's carefully constructed system of manipulation was being dismantled, piece by piece. My phone buzzed again, a message from Chairman Reynolds. The board is impressed with today's execution. Your approach to corporate reform is exactly what Riverstone needed. The woman Mark had dismissed as too soft had become the architect of his professional downfall. But more importantly, she had become a catalyst for genuine change. The $200,000 debt he'd left me with had become seed money for something priceless. The transformation of an entire corporate culture. Looking out over the city skyline, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the magnitude of the day's changes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, watching the lights below, I knew we had crossed a threshold. The era of fear and manipulation was ending, replaced by something stronger. Leadership based on integrity and trust. The immediate impact of our changes was already visible, but the real transformation was just beginning. Mark had taught me more than he realized about the mechanics of power. Now those lessons would fuel not just reform, but revolution. 1 month into my leadership, at Riverstone Financial, the changes had rippled far beyond our initial expectations. The 42nd floor had undergone a physical and cultural metamorphosis that reflected our new corporate philosophy. The intimidating, dark mahogany walls of the executive suite had been replaced with glass partitions, creating an environment of literal transparency. Mark's former special projects office, once a place where he'd pressured employees into unethical practices, had been transformed into a collaborative workspace where teams freely shared ideas and concerns. The quarterly numbers are in, Victoria Reeves announced during our morning executive meeting. Client satisfaction up 45%, employee retention increased by 60%, and our ethical investment portfolios are outperforming traditional ones by a significant margin. The statistics told only part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the daily interactions and atmosphere throughout the building. Junior analysts who had once lived in fear now confidently presented their findings. Administrative. Staff who had been forced to cover up questionable transactions now led initiatives for process improvement. David Patterson, once terrified of questioning authority, had emerged as a leader in our new risk assessment team. We've identified and restructured over 200 high-risk client portfolios, he reported, spreading documents across my desk. The clients are actually thanking us for the transparency. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a workspace that bore little resemblance to Mark's era of darkness. Every corner of the office now housed small groups of employees engaged in open discussion, sharing insights, and building upon each other's ideas. Ms. Mitchell, Amanda Torres appeared with her daily update. The ethics hotline has recorded 0 complaints this week. Instead, we're getting suggestions for improvement and requests for additional training. The transformation extended beyond our department. Other divisions within Riverstone had begun adopting our transparency protocols. The culture of fear that Mark had cultivated was being replaced by one of collaboration and mutual respect. Rachel, now heading our enhanced compliance team, had implemented a revolutionary client communication system. Every investment decision is now fully documented and explained, she demonstrated. Clients have real-time access to their portfolio details and risk assessments. From my office, I could see Mark in his new position on the 38th floor. His designer suits had given way to business casual attire. His commanding presence diminished to that of any other employee. The man who had once ruled through intimidation now experienced firsthand the environment he'd created. The board is impressed with the transformation, Chairman Reynolds commented during our weekly meeting. Your approach to corporate reform is becoming a model for other financial institutions. The changes weren't just internal. Industry publications had begun featuring articles about Riverstone's revolutionary approach to ethical investment. Our transparency initiatives were being studied by other firms looking to reform their own practices. Sarah Zhang, our previously quiet risk analyst, had developed an innovative system for identifying potential ethical conflicts before they became problems. It's based on the patterns we discovered in Mark's operations, she explained. By understanding how manipulation works, we can better prevent it. The physical transformation of the office continued as well. The intimidating corner offices had been converted into collaborative spaces. The hierarchical layout that had once separated management from staff had been replaced by an open floor plan that encouraged interaction and communication. You need to see this, Amanda said, bringing in another report. Employee satisfaction surveys show a complete reversal from 6 months ago. People actually look forward to coming to work now. Through the glass walls, I watched as teams gathered for their morning meetings. The nervous glances and fearful postures of Mark's era had been replaced by engaged discussions and confident presentations. Even the security team reported a dramatic decrease in stress-related incidents. Ms. Mitchell, Patricia from HR, appeared, with more updates. We've had 32 applications for internal promotions this week alone. People who were afraid to advance under the old system are now stepping forward. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some employees, conditioned by years of toxic leadership, struggled to adapt to an environment of transparency and accountability. We'd implemented support systems and training programs to help them transition. It's not just about changing policies, I explained during a leadership workshop. It's about healing the trauma of systematic manipulation and rebuilding trust from the ground up. My phone buzzed with a message from Maria Santos. Your corporate reform model is being discussed in financial circles. Several firms have requested consultations on implementing similar changes. The afternoon brought a visit from a team of industry regulators. Instead of the tense scrutiny that had characterized past inspections, they found a department eager to demonstrate its commitment to ethical practices. This is unprecedented, the lead inspector commented, reviewing our new oversight protocols. You've created systems that make manipulation virtually impossible while improving efficiency. Through my office windows, I spotted Mark attempting to navigate the new collaborative environment. His old tactics of intimidation fell flat in a workspace designed for transparency. The man who had once dominated through fear now struggled to contribute meaningfully to team discussions. "There's something you should see," Rachel said, entering with a stack of files. "Remember those high-risk investment packages Mark pushed? We've completely restructured them. The clients are actually seeing better returns under the ethical investment model." The transformation had extended to our client relationships as well. Instead of the high-pressure sales tactics Mark had advocated, we now focused on education and transparent communication. Clients were partners in their investment decisions, fully informed of both risks and opportunities. "Your story is inspiring others," Amanda mentioned, sharing an industry newsletter. "Other professionals who've faced similar betrayals are speaking up, pushing for reform in their own organizations." As evening approached, I stood by the window, observing the bustling office below. The woman Mark had tried to destroy had instead become a catalyst for industry-wide change. His betrayal, meant to break me, had instead created something powerful, a model for corporate reform based on integrity and transparency. My phone lit up with a message from Lisa. "Saw your interview in Financial Weekly. From personal debt to corporate revolution, you've turned trauma into transformation." The sunset painted the city skyline in shades of gold, reflecting off the glass walls that now symbolized our commitment to transparency. Mark's legacy of fear was being systematically replaced by something stronger, a corporate culture built on trust, ethics, and mutual respect. Chairman Reynolds appeared at my door. "The board wants to implement your reform model across all regional offices. Your experience with manipulation has given you unique insights into preventing it." The transformation continued to unfold, each day bringing new evidence of positive change. The $200,000 debt Mark had left me with had become seed money for a revolution in corporate culture. His attempt to destroy me had instead created someone capable of rebuilding not just a department, but an entire approach to business ethics. As the office lights dimmed for the evening, I reflected on how far we'd come. The broader transformation wasn't just about exposing past wrongs, it was about creating systems that prevented future ones. Mark had taught me the mechanics of manipulation. I had used that knowledge to build safeguards against it. The woman he'd dismissed as too soft had transformed his tactics of destruction into tools for positive change. The journey from victim to reformer had created something lasting, a model for corporate ethics that put humanity and integrity at its core. 3 months into Riverstone's transformation, I sat in my office reviewing the latest company-wide metrics. The numbers told a story of remarkable change, but the real evolution was visible in the daily interactions and shifting dynamics throughout the building. Mark's new position on the 38th floor had forced him to confront the consequences of his past leadership style. Through the quarterly reports, I could trace his gradual transformation from tyrannical department head to someone struggling to find his place in an ethical environment. "Ms. Mitchell," Amanda appeared at my door. "You need to see this." Mark submitted a proposal through our anonymous suggestion system. "It's actually quite insightful." I reviewed the document with interest. The proposal outlined improvements to our client protection protocols, drawing from his intimate knowledge of how manipulation worked. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had once exploited system vulnerabilities was now helping to prevent such exploitation. "There's more," Amanda continued. "He's been mentoring some of the junior analysts, helping them identify potential ethical conflicts in investment strategies. It's like he's using his experience with manipulation to prevent others from following that path." Through my office windows, I could see Mark working with a team of analysts. Gone was the intimidating stance, the threatening undertones. Instead, he spoke with them as equals, his knowledge of financial systems now serving a constructive purpose. David Patterson, once a victim of Mark's intimidation, had emerged as one of our strongest team leaders. "It's strange," he commented, during our weekly review. Mark actually apologized to me yesterday, said he regretted how he'd treated people under his leadership. The transformation wasn't limited to Mark. Rachel had evolved from a guilty participant in his schemes to a passionate advocate for corporate ethics. Her compliance team had become a model for other departments, demonstrating how transparency could coexist with efficiency. "The Personal Finance Workshop series is ready to launch," Rachel reported, spreading the materials across my desk. "We're starting with debt awareness and ethical financial management, using our experiences to help others avoid similar situations." The initiative had grown from our shared understanding of how financial manipulation worked. The $200,000 debt that Mark had left me with had become a teaching tool, helping others recognize and avoid predatory practices. Chairman Reynolds stopped by for an unexpected visit. "The board is impressed with more than just the numbers," he observed. "The cultural shift here is remarkable. Even those who once enabled toxic behavior are becoming advocates for change." I watched as Mark navigated the new collaborative environment. His expensive suits had given way to more modest attire. His demeanor shifted from commanding to cooperative. The man who had once ruled through fear was learning a different kind of strength. "Sarah," he approached my office hesitantly one afternoon, "I've been working on something I think you should see." He presented a detailed analysis of his past manipulation techniques, transformed into a comprehensive guide for preventing similar abuses. Each pattern he'd once used to exploit was now documented as a warning sign, each tactic explained to help others avoid falling victim. "I know it doesn't make up for anything," he said quietly, "but maybe it can help protect others from people like who I used to be." The document revealed more than just professional insight. It showed genuine reflection and understanding of the damage his actions had caused. The man who had once dismissed me as too soft was finally grasping the true meaning of strength. Victoria. Reeves joined us for the afternoon executive meeting. "The industry is taking notice," she reported. "Our ethical investment model is outperforming traditional approaches. Turns out transparency actually improves profitability." Through the glass walls, I could see teams collaborating across departments. The rigid hierarchies of Mark's era had given way to fluid communication and shared purpose. Even he had found a place within this new structure, his experience with manipulation becoming a valuable tool for prevention. "The transformation isn't just professional," Amanda observed. "People are applying these principles in their personal lives. The financial literacy programs, the ethics workshops, they're changing how people think about power and trust." Mark's evolution became most apparent during a department-wide training session. He stood before his former subordinates, openly acknowledging his past behavior and sharing insights on recognizing toxic leadership patterns. "I used to think power meant control," he admitted to the gathered employees. "I was wrong. Real strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating an office environment that had evolved beyond recognition. The fear that had once permeated every interaction had been replaced by authentic collaboration and mutual respect. "You've created something remarkable here," Chairman Reynolds commented during our end-of-quarter review. "Not just a reformed department, but a model for corporate evolution." My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Remember when you thought, the debt would destroy you? Look at what you've built from those ashes." The woman Mark had tried to break had instead become an architect of transformation, not just for herself, but for an entire corporate culture. His betrayal had sparked changes neither of us could have imagined. As the day drew to a close, I watched Mark gathering his things to leave. The man who had once dominated through fear now moved through the office with quiet purpose, his past actions becoming lessons for positive change. "Sarah," he paused by my door. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you for showing me a better way to lead, to live. The sunset painted the city skyline in shades of possibility. The journey from victim to victor had evolved into something more meaningful, a transformation that touched not just systems and policies, but human hearts and minds. Mark's attempt to destroy me through debt and betrayal had instead created someone capable of revolutionary change. The softness he had scorned had become a strength that transformed not just a department, but an entire approach to corporate leadership. The character evolution wasn't limited to individuals. It had rippled through the entire organization, creating a new paradigm of business ethics. The woman who had once trusted blindly now led with informed compassion, turning tools of manipulation into instruments of positive change. As the office lights dimmed, I reflected on how far we'd all come. The transformation from victims and villains to advocates for change had created something lasting, a model for corporate evolution that put human dignity at its core. The $200,000 debt that was meant to break me had become the foundation for rebuilding not just a career, but an entire corporate culture. Mark's betrayal had taught me the mechanics of manipulation. I had used that knowledge to create systems of protection and growth. Looking out over the city lights, I knew the evolution would continue. Each day brought new opportunities for positive change, new chances to transform past pain into future protection. The woman Mark had dismissed as too soft had become a catalyst for lasting transformation. 1 year after taking the position at Riverstone Financial, I stood at the podium during the annual shareholders meeting, reflecting on a journey that had transformed not just a company, but an entire industry's approach to ethical leadership. Under our new management structure, I announced to the packed auditorium, Riverstone has seen a 180% increase in client trust ratings, a 165% rise in employee satisfaction, and our ethical investment portfolios have outperformed traditional models by 45%. From my position on stage, I could see Mark sitting in the middle rows, nodding along with the statistics. He had earned respect in his new role, not through intimidation, but through genuine expertise and dedication to reform. His journey from manipulator to mentor had become a case study in redemption. The numbers were impressive, but they weren't the full story. Beyond the metrics, I continued, we've created a culture where integrity isn't just a buzzword. It's the foundation of everything we do. After the presentation, during the reception, I found myself standing next to Mark at the refreshment table. The awkwardness that had once characterized our interactions had evolved into something neither of us had expected: professional respect. I found our old mortgage documents last week, he said quietly, stirring his coffee. Looking at those forged signatures now, I can't believe who I was back then. The debt I left you with, it was meant to destroy you. Instead, it became the foundation for something better, I replied, watching various team members mingling confidently with shareholders. Sometimes our worst moments become our best teachers. David Patterson approached, practically glowing with excitement. Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Harrison, the Singapore office just approved our joint ethical investment framework. They're implementing it next quarter. I watched as Mark engaged with David, offering genuine insights about client protection and risk management. The transformation in both men was remarkable. One had risen from fearful junior analyst to confident leader, while the other had journeyed from tyrannical boss to respected advisor. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Chairman Reynolds joined me on the balcony overlooking the city lights. When we hired you, he mused, we expected someone to clean up a department. What you've given us is a revolution in corporate culture that's becoming a template for the entire industry. The city sparkled below, so different from the night I discovered Mark's betrayal. Sometimes the best revolutions aren't about destroying what's broken, I reflected. They're about transforming it into something better. Rachel approached, with the latest compliance reports. The woman who had once been both victim and participant in Mark's schemes had become a fierce advocate for ethical practice. The new client protection protocols are being adopted by 3 other major firms, she reported proudly. The transformation hadn't just been professional. The experience had taught all of us profound lessons about power, trust, and redemption. The $200,000 debt that was meant to break me had instead revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. Ms. Mitchell, Amanda appeared with a small envelope. This came for you. Inside was a check from Mark for $200,000, along with a note. This can't undo the past, but it can help build the future. The Ethical Investment Workshop program needs funding, and this seems like the right place for this money to go. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. Standing at my office window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of possibility, I realized that the true victory wasn't in repaid debt or professional success. It was in the transformation of human hearts and systems, in the creation of something that would outlast all of us. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Saw Riverstone's feature in Business Weekly. Remember when you thought your life was over? Look at you now, honey. You didn't just survive, you revolutionized. I smiled, thinking of that devastating night 1 year ago. Mark's words, "You'll never survive this," had lost their sting entirely. They'd become merely the opening lines of a much greater story. One not of revenge, but of reformation, growth, and the kind of success that comes from lifting others as you rise. Victoria Reeves stopped by my office one last time that evening. The board wants to implement your leadership model across all global offices, she announced. Your approach to turning betrayal into positive change, it's exactly what the industry needs. The office lights dimmed automatically, signaling the end of another day at the new Riverstone Financial. Through the glass walls, I could see Mark gathering his things, stopping to offer guidance to a junior team member. The man who had once used his knowledge to manipulate, now used it to protect and educate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I savored the knowledge that sometimes life's worst betrayals become catalysts for its greatest transformations. The woman Mark had dismissed as too soft had created something he never could through force, a culture of genuine strength built on integrity and trust. As I gathered my things to leave, I passed the wall where we'd hung our new company mission statement, "Success through integrity, growth through transparency." Below it, in smaller letters, was the phrase that had become my personal mantra. True power lies not in breaking others, but in lifting them up. The city lights twinkled against the darkening sky as I made my way to my car. Each light represented someone affected by our changes. Clients whose savings were now truly protected, employees who no longer worked in fear, industry professionals inspired to create their own ethical reforms. The journey from betrayed wife to corporate reformer had taught me that real strength often comes disguised as softness, that the deepest wounds can become the foundation for the most meaningful healing, and that true success isn't about winning at all costs. It's about creating victories that lift everyone higher. The final resolution wasn't just about personal triumph or professional achievement. It was about the ripple effect of transformation, how one person's journey from victim to victor could catalyze change far beyond its original scope. Mark's betrayal had taught me more than he ever intended about power, trust, and leadership. Those lessons had become the building blocks of something far more valuable than money, a legacy of ethical reform that would continue to grow and evolve long after our personal story was forgotten. As I drove home through the glittering city streets, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be, and then using that strength to create positive change in the world. The woman who had once been broken by betrayal had become a builder of better systems, a transformer of corporate culture, and a living proof that softness, when combined with purpose, becomes an unstoppable force for good. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.